Welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Thursday, February 13th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Texas game in 198 days, the game against Michigan in 289 days. Ohio State has hired a new defensive coordinator, and whoo boy, do people have thoughts. Today we're going to be checking in with our buddy Ross Fulton, the X's and O's guru at BuckeyeHuddle.com, to get his thoughts. Probably, I'm going to guess, a little more measured than some of those that have been expressed online. When Ross is on the show, we are sponsored by Jeff Ruby's of Columbus, proudly offering nationally acclaimed USDA prime steaks, seafood and sushi, impeccable service, live entertainment, and an attention to detail that is simply unmatched. Just go to jeffruby.com/Columbus, check out the menu, and make a reservation for today. And I'm just going to throw this out there, gentlemen. Valentine's Day is coming up, so if you have a lady in your life, I would guess Jeff Ruby's would be a lovely place to take her in or on or around Valentine's Day. So just throwing that out there again, jeffruby.com/Columbus. You'll thank me later. All right. I'm going to thank Ross right now for coming on because, Ross, the temperature around the reaction to the Matt Patricia hire has been at a boiling point or slightly higher than that for, almost immediately. There were really, really strong reactions, both pro and con. So we're going to try and sort through this and figure out yes, no, maybe so. We're going to start, though, let's start with some background information on Matt Patricia. Just scheme, what is Matt Patricia's specialty as a defensive coach? Does he have a specific position group he specializes in? What does a Matt Patricia defense look like? What are his influences? Give us some sort of background information to sort of start with on him.
Yeah, I highly recommend. He did a relatively recent podcast. I guess it's on YouTube. You can find it with Julian Edelman. Apparently, Julian Edelman has his own podcast. It was very interesting because it starts out with them talking about the history of Matt Patricia's time. I guess you'd say with the Patriots, but the development of the defense. And, as you'd expect, there's a lot of, Bill Parcells influence, Nick Saban, Romeo Crennel, Mangini, like the list of all the Parcells people, right? It's so, his background is as mostly like defensive line, like front. So it does fit what we talked about the last time we were talking about who could be the defensive coordinator in terms of Day looking to pair someone who's has a background in dealing with defensive line in the front six with having Tim Walton and Matt Guerreri as your secondary coaches who, both not coincidentally also got at least title bumps. And so, in terms of like what they do, again, like I recommend that podcast because, and this gets into like part of the interesting part about the college is like, they did so much, it's hard to even put there's not even a way to describe it really. Yes, Belichick, like Nick Saban was like traditionally like a 3-down odd front, but like they played lots of 4-2-5. They would play one gap. They would play 1.5 gaps. They would play 2 gaps. They would play 1 gap to one side and 2 gap to the other side. They would play every coverage you got. Like I've seen people call Matt Patricia like a cover 1 guy. He says in the podcast that like people have labeled him a cover 2 guy at times. But as he talks about, like it really was very personnel dependent for what they had when they were at the Patriots. It was dependent as he talks about, like in terms of like both in terms of like the strengths of their players, but also like the experience levels of how much they could do in the back end, and very matchup dependent. Like, against the Rams in the Super Bowl, like Belichick ran a 6-1 front, like pulled it out, because that was good against the Rams outside zone game at the time. So, like, I think when you're coming to college, like the real thing is like Matt Patricia in that, YouTube is be like, they had the playbook but then they also had like what he called the Bible, which was like full of every scheme known to man and some they came up with in addition. So college, like you just don't like, it's not their full-time job. They're younger. You have less time. They're, part of why NFL players are so good is like not just the physical traits. It's like the mental aptitude for it as well. They're younger, as I said, and like you just don't Wink Martindale had some of this issues at Michigan earlier in the season where, he's trying to run like a bunch of exotic third down pressures that he ran with the Ravens and the Giants and elsewhere. And like they were busting coverages and busting fits at the front and like really pared that down by the end of the season, but it took a little while to get there. So like really a question of like, how do you make things work with college kids? Like in terms of like making the scheme something that's manageable. And we can get into what I think that might look like. And also though, just like teaching, hasn't been in college for 25 years. And so it's just different than dealing with professionals.
One of the things that you were very active on our board in the thread about this, so I kind of have a little bit of a cliff notes on your thoughts on some of this stuff already. But how does you said he kind of does a little bit of everything, but how does some of the stuff that he does fit with what they were doing at the end of last year, which is, that would at least give a little bit of continuity in terms of scheme and that kind of stuff. And I assume with Tim Walton and Matt Guerreri having some kind of a vote in this, that you would presumably have some continuity there. How does that mesh with the stuff that Matt Patricia likes to do?
Yeah, and I mean, again, like with Tim Walton and Guerreri getting title bumps, and I thought this going in the whole time, like the one sort of thread between at least some of the names that were rumored for the job, like, who knows how much was real and not real, but was they were all kind of had backgrounds as like guys who'd coached defensive line or linebackers. And so much more of like the front. And so I thought that Ryan Day probably had some interest in like continuity in what Ohio State was doing in the back end. I mean, certainly post Oregon 1 game. And then, be able to mix it up more up front. Like, Patricia will use lots of sim pressures, bring forward, but from different guys, fire zones, etc. Like use a 2-4, like he'll again, like move guys around a little bit more. Which again, like, see how that works in college. So I think there may be more continuity than one might expect. I think he's coached a lot of things. Like he'll watch the tape and see like Ohio State did a lot of good things last year and like know that that's what players can do to succeed. But I think you'll see, the one thing that you can, as he talks about in the YouTube video, like the optimistic take, right, is that like the Patriots always use their personnel very well. Like they featured guys, like he talks about, like they got Pat Chung and like suddenly they had a safety who could cover, right? And that like changed what they did, or they adjusted, they used a big nickel. And so like lots of matching personnel. So, his first task is going to be like, how do I maximize Caleb Downs again? Right. Like that's like the crown jewel piece. And so I would assume like you'll continue to see lots of, using Downs at the second level, using him like cutting crossers, where he can be active and like, because as well as he can do it, like we saw this year, like when Caleb Downs was just playing a deep safety, like lots of teams could just avoid him. Right. And so you want him to have an impact. But like, so again, like everything they were doing, like they can do, like, cover 2, cover 3 matching, cover 4, every kind of different types of matching. But like, as he talked about, like the other hopeful thing you would say is that, as he talks about in that YouTube video, like, as I alluded to, when they were a younger, less experienced defense, like they played more kind of base zones, like less matching where things could go wrong or you could have busts, right? Or like, kept things, could cut things down or like ramp things up depending on the personnel they had and the experience levels. And so, that to me at least shows someone who is at least self-aware or trying to be that, things need to be adjusted based on your personnel and like what your players can do.
And adjusting things to personnel is interesting, especially on the front end of the defense, because Ohio State has been a 4-down team for basically the length of Larry Johnson's time, even probably going back before that to a certain degree. But Ryan Day it's sort of been talked about that Ryan Day was considering maybe looking at more of an odd front look. And this is Matt Patricia, as you said, is something of an odd front guy. So what are you expecting the defensive front to look like this year? Or, and I guess part of that question is, what do they have the personnel to do? If they do a good job of adjusting to the personnel, what does the personnel that they have, what would that be suggestive in terms of what they might be looking to do this fall?
Yeah, I mean, again, like as we've discussed, post that first Oregon game, right? Like they were a 4-down team using lots of odd front or gap and half principles, right? We're talking about like heavy techniques, lagging, spilling the football outside. So like in some ways that battle was like already fought, and like may have left Jim Knowles as a casualty in terms of like his desire to continue on. But like they did those things in the, in the second half of the season. What I would say is, like, in terms of personnel, they're obviously pretty thin at defensive line, right? They do have a big nose tackle, and Caden McDonald, who like gives you the opportunity to gap some stuff at nose if you wanted to do that, like the Patriots did for a long time with Vince Wilfork. They have Edric Houston, who got to play a lot as a true freshman. And they have some possibilities of guys who could be more of edge or hybrid type. So I would expect, just like I expected with Jim Knowles going next year, to be honest. So like you see more of a mix and match of fronts, some 4-down stuff, some 3-down stuff, but like the principles remain the same either way in terms of like, how you're trying to spill the football or lag or, play gap and a half and cancel out blocks rather than trying to penetrate in the backfield up front.
One of the things that's gotten talked about a bunch, and this may have come up in that podcast, I have not listened to that one yet, but it is next on my list, is he spent the last year sort of studying the college game with Bill Belichick. And Belichick, of course, now is at North Carolina. And the natural question is, why didn't he bring Matt Patricia with as his defensive coordinator? And the answer is because he has a son who he brought as a defensive coordinator. But what kind of things, do you have any idea of what kind of things that they learned about studying the college game in the last year, or big takeaways in terms of, hey, this is not going to work, this is going to work, or hey, you have to do things a lot differently? Like what was there any kind of indication on what his big takeaways were from his year, studying up in the Alps with Bill Belichick, looking at college film?
Yeah, I have not heard, but I think again, Ohio State fans should be heartened by the fact they like put that time and effort in. Like that's a lot of defensive experience, putting their heads together. But, it's going to be the things like that we talked about. And like, these are the challenges of, again, like a Wink Martindale, just as a most recent example, like you face like different hash marks are a big deal, right? Like the college hash marks where you have a much more significant difference between the field and the boundary, like that makes a big difference and you have to adjust to that. Obviously, like you're just dealing with a lot of the time, like a very different quarterback level, both just in terms of like, how much you can be threatened vertically, but also like, the use of the quarterback run game. That's obviously more prevalent in the NFL than it probably even was when he was with Belichick, with the Patriots, less so when he was the head coach of the Lions, but that's obviously become more of it, but it's still different. Right. So, there's just less volume in college football. You just really get your sort of like standard, run game, like not a lot of like pro style stuff like you get. So there's differences. And like, again, I think that a lot of it will be like, how can I streamline things in a way that works for college players? How can I like emphasize the fundamentals that I need? And then like, how can I maximize my talent? As I said, like the good thing is like Ohio State obviously loses a lot of players, but they have Caleb Downs back and they have other guys who are sort of like those hybrid types that they had a lot of success with at the Patriots, whether it's like sort of outside linebacker, defensive end edge type, like a Sonny Styles, whether it's a Caleb Downs or like having different variations of nickels that you can use, whether it's like sort of like a linebacker safety hybrid or a corner hybrid. So I think you'll just see a lot of that, personnel focus as well.
I wanted to, before we get to the final question, which is I'm going to ask you for to sort of settle the debate in terms of disaster, grand slam, or somewhere in between. Before we get to that, I do want to just kind of level set for people for 2025, because I'm not sure people have completely moved on from 2024, which is great. Like, by all means, enjoy the national championship for a little while longer. It feels to me like the 2024 Ohio State defense might be the best Ohio State defense people see in their lifetime, or at least in a generation, or at least in a decade, or certainly at least in the next 24 months or so. Just the combination of veteran players all being back, third year with a very good defensive coordinator, like you're almost guaranteed to see a drop off this fall. And that's true whether you brought Jim Knowles back, whether you bring in Matt Patricia, or whether you hire whoever else anyone else wanted to hire as a defensive coordinator. I mean, am I off on anything there? Is that what is a realistic expectation for is absolutely they can maintain this level no problem, or is this maybe going to be you lose 8 starters, many of whom were fourth year guys, plus you're changing your defensive coordinator? Like, prepare yourself. The defense might be slightly less amazing this year, and that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a realistic expectation, right? Like, they have enough pieces that they should still be very good. And again, it gets to like, there's sort of this dichotomy of pre and post that Oregon game in terms of the defense. And even then it was like kind of up and down. So like, in theory, I guess again, the optimistic take is that like Matt Patricia sort of doubles down on some of the stuff that we felt were missing at times for the Ohio State defense for whatever reason, like whether that was the lack of continuity on the defensive staff or, more sim pressures, more fire zones, more variation, more techniques up front that let you play with split safeties, more odd front stuff. So, if you have that there, I think they have the pieces. I think, again, the biggest question to me with the defense is up front, just in terms of depth, especially, and like maybe defensive end. I think like outside of Kenyatta Jackson is kind of a question mark. But like, I guess on a lighter note, I'll leave people with the fact that one thing he does talk about in the YouTube video is that when at the Patriots, when they had handsy defensive backs, they would tape their hands during practice. So Davison Igbinosun can probably expect to have like a lot of masking tape on his hands throughout the spring.
Well, that'll be fun. We'll try and get some good photos and video of that whenever we're in practice this spring. All right, we did. Tony Gurman and I did a live show, sort of an instant reaction show, and the comments were not quite evenly split, but fairly split between this is a total disaster and the worst hire in the history of American employment, and this is going to be amazing. And it's this is a guy who was a multiple-time defensive coordinator on a Super Bowl winner and all that kind of stuff. So, with 1 being total disaster and 10 being a grand slam, Ross, give us your final grade on this, and this will be something that we mention on every show moving forward. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm probably somewhere in the middle. Like, I have to say that, like, we'll see how it goes, which is like obviously always the most annoying thing that people say, because obviously none of us know how it's going to go in anything in life. But I think I've given some cases for optimism. Like, I know people have sort of jumped to like the Nick Saban, former head coach rehab program, but I do think there are some similarities in the sense that when Saban would bring in those guys, like Bill O'Brien, Sarkisian, etc., like there was a lot more continuity than change in what Alabama was doing offensively. And like, I do think that there is going to be that similar framework in place. Like, maybe they don't do the 3 high stuff, but that was like only like a fraction of what they were doing. Right. But I just think, especially with like the Walton and Guerreri bumps and like titles, I just think there's going to be a lot more continuity. As I said, I think that like, Patricia, he's obviously like a divisive figure. Like, I see people wonder how he'll teach. Other people like he's great at fundamentals. I saw Bobby Carpenter, who played for him, like speak his praises highly. Like, none of us, short of people who played for him or worked with him, can really speak to it like that. I do think that this is going to probably be, I think it is similar to the Nick Saban situation or the Chip Kelly situation, where like, I think this is like, Chip Kelly came in, he ran Ryan Day's offense, which a little bit different situation because like that was their offense together. He put his own pieces or flavor to it, and his goal was to succeed and get back to the NFL. And I think that's probably true with Matt Patricia. As I said, I think he'll try, because he's done so much and he's been pretty flexible in his career. I think I keep saying I think you'll see a lot of continuity. Again, I think it's just a question of like how, it's one thing to study it. Like, how do you adjust to the college game? How does the staff work together? I mean, I think sitting here today, I personally still don't know whether Larry Johnson is going to be back or not. How does that all work together? Obviously, like there was like Jim Knowles left for a reason. How does this back end situation work with, Patricia? I think he'll, in an ideal world, as I said, there's lots of continuity there. He gets to really focus on like game plans and like, diversifying what they do up front and mixing up the pressure schemes more, particularly like they're going to need that for the reasons we talked about with like less being able to, for all the flack that they took, like JT Tuimoloau and Jack Sawyer created a lot of pressure and were pretty, exemplary players at defensive end over their careers for Ohio State. So they're going to need to be able to sort of generate pressure from more angles. So I think it's just like sort of, I was not expecting that, him to be like, you would never have gotten Matt Patricia's name out of me, a week ago when you asked me like possibilities. On the other hand, like when people are like, the sky is falling, like no one can give me like who would have been their ideal choice. Right. And so it's like, I can't sit here and say like X, Y, or Z is perfect. I've had people throw names at me that I think, for a variety of reasons, like I'm not sure that would have worked. It would have been a change in scheme. I think this way you're sort of bringing in like on top of this staff dynamic, someone who has some gravitas and has the NFL background, that sort of brings an adult to the room, for lack of a better term. And lets, Ryan Day focus more back on the offense with this younger staff with Brian Hartline as basically a new play caller for the first time. And so I think it's sort of, there's a mushy middle here.
Well, boy, it was going to be an interesting spring, and now it's going to be a super interesting spring. You're going to have all sorts of questions around Brian Hartline, and when's he going to start calling plays, and is he going to be calling the offense all spring? And then now you've got the defensive side of the ball, and how's that all going to fit together, and what's the defense going to look like, and how's the personnel going to fit, and who's going to be, oh man, is there going to be lots to talk about. I can't wait. This is going to be a really, really fun spring. And for everyone who is really, really just desperately angry or upset about this, I will remind you two things. Go back and listen. Ross is not jumping off the roof yet, so that's probably a good sign. If your smart football friend is not jumping off the roof, you should probably not jump off the roof either. And number two, it has been 3 weeks and 3 days since Ohio State won the national championship. You're allowed to just enjoy that a little longer before you start worrying about whatever's coming next. So
yeah, and I will say I was pretty negative on when Ryan Day hired Kerry Combs, and I mean at that point I felt like most of the fan base was the opposite way. Like, oh great, we got this Buckeye who's a rah guy, and I was like, well, scheme wise this could be so. I think Matt Patricia is far removed from that situation.
All right. Well, there you go. Even more reason for optimism. Why don't you celebrate the hiring of Matt Patricia with a nice dinner at Jeff Ruby's Steakhouse, the award-winning upscale steakhouse in downtown Columbus, named one of the top 50 steakhouses in America by Food Network. Again, Valentine's Day is coming. Matt Patricia is coming to town. Lots of reasons to celebrate at Jeff Ruby's Columbus. Go to jeffruby.com/Columbus to check out the menu and make a reservation for today. That'll do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.